So thank you so much for all turning up today. I'm Becky, and thank you for joining us this evening to celebrate Rian's debut book, XX, a novel graphic. I'm really looking forward to the talk to hear more about it. Please can you make sure that you all have your microphones turned off? Sadly, we don't have the function to be able to mute all on our Zoom settings, so we'd really appreciate your help with this. But it sounds like at the moment everyone has theirs turned off, so hopefully you're all well versed in this by now. If there are any technical difficulties, we will try to rectify them as soon as possible. But if all fails, we will host the talk again at a later date. And of course, you'll be all given a ticket and we can make it happen then. But hopefully that won't happen. The talk, just so you know, is being recorded and will be available to watch again via our Vimeo on demand channel. But none of your videos or faces will be seen, so don't worry. It's just so you know that we're doing that. If you don't know, all proceeds from tonight's talk go to the St Bride Library, which is one of London's hidden gems tucked away on a back street behind Fleet Street. It houses possibly the largest collection of printing, typographic and design books and related ephemera in the world, dating back from 1400 BC up until the present day, and it has many treasures to be found. So your money is going to a really good cause and help keeping it running for future generations to enjoy. You can actually view our collections and do research and things as normal again by booking a visit to our reading room. This is open every Wednesday, but you need to pre-book due to the current climate with COVID-19. We are also taking part in Open House 2020, and you can find further details about this in the links in the Zoom comments box, which I'll put there in a minute, or on our website. We have more online lectures planned this year, and next week is the next iMagazine Type Tuesday event with Rick Poyner and special guests celebrating the launch of his new book about David King, who was a designer, activist and visual historian. You can find out more information on our website about this too. I've heard it's going to be a really fantastic evening and they've got some great guests, so do come along to that if you can. If you missed our last lecture with letterpress printer Elizabeth Fraser, you can now rent the talk via our Vimeo on demand channel. We would highly recommend that you check this out. Details can be found in the comments box too on how to access this, which I'll again put there in a minute. We are also delighted to announce that our journal, Ultra Bold, designed and edited by Simon Loxley, is back after a 4-year break. It is full of fantastic content where Mark Titchener talks about his experiences of creating thought-provoking art for public spaces. Alice Savoy tells us about the creative processes behind her fawn type family. Claire Walters shows us the magic behind stories without words. Ben Walsh photographs Black Lives Matter. Bob Richardson looks at some more gems from the library's collection, plus graffiti and graphics of a pandemic. I've had a sneak preview and it looks fantastic and so much great content in there. It's really highly recommended. And you can purchase this through the St Bride online shop on our website. Now that's enough waffle from me. I'm really pleased to introduce you to designer, illustrator, typographer and comic book artist and now author Rian Hughes, who will share with us the incredible process and amount of hard work that went into creating his stunning debut novel and how he explores the narrative potential of graphic design and typography. For those of you who ordered a ticket with a book, I just want to let you know that these are going to be coming in the post in the next week or so. And as you can see, I've got my copy here and it's a good 1,000 pages thick and I'm about 250 in, and so far it's a fantastic read and I can't wait to read more and hear more about the process behind it. I do want to let you know that there are a few spoilers coming if you haven't read it yet, so we're sorry about that, but due to the nature of the talk it couldn't really be avoided. And at the end there'll be a Q&A, so please do add your questions in the comments box as you think of them, and we will ask them once the talk is over to Rian. So thank you very much, and now I'll hand over to Rian. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. Hello, everyone. This is kind of weird, but I shall crack on. Normally, if this was a talk at St Bride, there'd be a bar at the back selling beer. So I hope you can all reach out behind you and grab a beer. So cheers. Thank you for joining us. I've got an invisible beer. It's the worst kind of beer. Right, as Becky said, there will be a few spoilers, so apologies in advance, but it's very hard to talk about a book without actually talking about a book. So I won't give away, hopefully, too much. I'll sort of talk about the form and the themes of it without sort of telling you what happens sort of in the end to the characters. So the genesis of this book, before I start actually, what I should probably do is for the benefit of those who, oh, hang on, let me get this, there we go. Is I should sort of probably fill in a bit of my background. So this is the first novel I've ever written. I'm not a novelist. Well, I wasn't a novelist. What I do, or what I have been doing over the last sort of few decades really, is a combination of illustration, comic strip work, graphic design and type design, and the kind of confluence of these disciplines, and the fact that there is a confluence of the disciplines sort of feeds into what the novel's about. So I'm going to briefly show you a few things here. These are sort of examples of the kind of illustration stuff I've done over the years, and also a lot of logo design. Again, a lot of stuff for comic books and pop culture, sort of music, publishing, things like that. And sort of design, again, for a lot of comic book design, music, collections of old vintage lettering. There's a few books I've done that collate a lot of old vintage lettering from the 60s, 70s, 50s, 40s and 50s, and the 20s and 30s, which is the most recent one. And the comic strips, I sort of began drawing comics 2000 AD, and then from there began working for DC as a comic book artist and a designer, and for Marvel and for many of the other comic book companies across the world as well. And I still do dabble occasionally with comics, although not nearly as often as I'd like to. For example, in the bottom right here is a Batman black and white page. So that was a sort of brilliant, fun thing to do. And one day I will have a bit more time, and maybe I'm in my retirement, I'll do a bit more comics again. And the fonts, I have a font foundry called Device, and we're regularly releasing fonts, and have been probably since, to begin with, I was releasing them through Font Shop in the early days, and then set up my own foundry, and have been releasing fonts fairly steadily since then. So these sort of disparate skills are designing fonts, sort of an interest in storytelling and narrative, which is to the forefront of graphic design, and a sense of authorship. And one of the problems that I'm sure that frustrate a lot of graphic designers is that we're primarily, most of the time, a service industry. We dress up other people's ideas, but we don't create content ourselves, or if we do create content ourselves, it's kind of, again, in the service of some product or some cause or something like that. It's not the thing in and of itself. And when you're working as a comic artist or a musician or a painter, you're creating material for its own sake. You're not creating it for a client. The thing, you buy a comic to read the comic, not because the comic is advertising something else. It may be supported by advertising in the comic, but that's not why you buy it. If you buy a record, you're listening to the music. It's not, imagine if the only music that musicians made was jingles for adverts. That's kind of what graphic designers are like. Not always, but a lot of the time. So there is music for music's sake, comic for comic book's sake. There's very rarely graphic design for graphic design's sake, where people buy it for the design. The design is the thing that you are actually in the business for. So I always thought that there was a room for something that I called narrative graphic design. And there was an exhibition, there was a Typo Circle exhibition, 40 years of the Typo Circle at the Protein Gallery, I think in 2016. And they had all these cabinets with old issues of Circular, the magazine, out. And I was looking in this cabinet, and there was an interview with me from, I can't remember what issue it was, but issue 9 or something like that. So probably sort of early 90s or something. And in there was an interview with me saying, I think there's this thing called narrative graphic design that I'd like to explore one day. So I'm looking at this sort of 25 years later and thinking, that's what I should be doing. I've got to do that thing. So this is that thing. So when was that? That was 2016. So it's taken another 4 years to get to this point. So it has been quite a lot of work. But let me talk you through it. So I called it a novel, graphic. Obviously as a pun for a graphic novel, which has already proven to be a problem because I went into my local Waterstones and it was with all the Spider-Man comics. So I may have messed up on that one, but anyway. So this is what it looks like under the cover. So there are several themes that I'll explain in this. One is the idea that images and type and graphic design is a vessel for ideas. What are those ideas? Well, they could be anything. They could be alien ideas. They could be powerful memes. So this is what the spine and the front cover of the book look like. And so we have this supremacist Kazimir Malevich black square and this little figure, which is XX, the double X of the title, which I'll explain who this chap is. And then on the spine, we have this digital signal, which again forms a major part of the narrative. So what I've done here, these are the first pages, these are the first spreads of the book. And what I've done here is, it's a bit like what they call a cold open. So you don't open with the titles, you have a scene, if you like, and then the titles. So I've never seen a book with a cold open before, but it opens with this intermittent digital signal that leads you into the first page. So there are parts of this novel which are sort of set and written in a fairly straightforward novelistic fashion. And I think that the reason I did that was that I wanted to differentiate between when the more experimental typographic stuff is happening, it had to have some kind of more neutral framing device. Otherwise, everything would be weird typography. And I wanted the more experimental typography to jump out and be more important, framed within the context of this more regular looking novel. So you then go straight into the opening sort of pages of the novel. And then after those opening pages, you then get the half title and then the title as you would in a normal book. So again, you get this sort of recurring motif of this black square, which is also the logo of this in-novel company called Intelligentsia. And if you look at the right-hand side here, there are several different threads to this that sort of coalesce at the end. And these different threads are told through newspaper reports or email exchanges or more regular sort of novelistic forms where you have an omniscient narrator who's telling you the story. And even those bits where the omniscient narrator, who's basically me, the author, I kind of play with that as a form later on as well. So anyway, this signal is received at Jodrell Bank, and it's a digital signal. It's noughts and ones. No one really knows what it is. Meanwhile, there's this tech startup in Hoxton, one of the partners of whom is there's a thing called Apophenia, which is the ability to see patterns. So if you saw a face in a cloud, for example, that would be Apophenia. So these or the face on Mars, things like this, things that may or may not have meaning, the ability to see pattern, but maybe the ability to see patterns when there are no patterns. Anyway, so our various characters are trying to figure out what this signal from space might be about. And then before they can really work on it, it's leaked out onto the internet. And so people are making art from it. It's sort of open source sort of field day on what this signal actually might mean. Meanwhile, our sort of character who we follow, Jack, it feels like he's getting messages. He's walking around London taking random photographs, and in the photographs it seems like someone's sending him messages. So maybe shop fronts or billboards, or like John Nash in A Beautiful Mind, maybe adverts in magazines. He thinks that someone might actually be trying to talk to him here. So he's seeing faces in letters on fridge doors in this example here. And meanwhile this is happening, there's some footage, some mysterious footage that is apparently that has apparently been taken on the far side of the moon at a secret installation that no one has actually admitted exists, called Daedalus Base, but people suspect it's there. And so in this sort of data breach, which includes the signal, there's this weird footage that seems to be taken from the helmet, the camera on top of a space person's helmet. And it's become this kind of weird palimpsest on which people, again, in a sort of apophenia kind of way, project what they think they see in this mysterious piece of film. It becomes a bit like, I don't know, there's a Zapruder film or something like this, sort of is analysed frame by frame, and people write essays about what this might mean, what they actually can see in this footage. So our hero, if you like, Jack, this is another example where he sees someone with a T-shirt which has got the pulsar trace, which was used for Unknown Pleasures, but originally was a pulsar trace. You can see it on the bottom right here. So in his mind's eye, he sort of writes a bit of Mathematica code that can reproduce this image. So he's sort of data processing the whole time. And another sort of theme throughout the book is the encoding of language. So while they're trying to figure out what this signal means, and they have discussions about how you would encode meaning in a signal, even if we did convert it to letters or symbols, unless we actually are familiar with that language, might we still not be able to make head or tail of it. So here we have Rongo Rongo, which is the extinct language of Easter Island, and there are various putative translations of this. In fact, it's available in Unicode. You could actually design a font in Rongo Rongo if you want, which I think is a nice touch. But again, here what I've done is on two separate pages, separated by more than 100 pages here, the corner of the book has been torn off on the right-hand one and then tucked into the page earlier on with one of the other characters' email address written on it. So there are examples where the book that you're reading is actually in the book. So Jack, our character, will lift up a book to make a point about it being a container for an idea, and he'll describe that the book you're actually reading. So I'm sort of trying to sort of get meta about the the physical shape of the container for the information, which is lettering, alphabets, the form of the book, and the information it contains, and how there can be quite a gap between these two things. You can have the container, but you don't understand the information, or you can have information that may not exist in the kind of familiar containers like books that we usually think of. Anyway, so Jack is sort of seeing these messages in the environment around him, and they seem to say to him, "Build me a body so I can speak." So while Jack is sort of thinking he's slowly going mad, other people are doing things with this signal from space. And one of the things that they do is that they make music from it. So I wrote this fake music review in sort of typical NME circa 85 pretentious music journalist speak. So this album is described as a sonic cathedral of sound. And what was really nice about this is that a friend of mine, DJ Food, who was one of the people who had an early copy of this, has made this album. So it actually exists. DJ Food and Rian Hughes, my sister, and a few other collaborators have put this fantastic album together based on this review. So if you point your camera phone at that QR code you can see up on your screen at the moment, you will be able to hear this album. I mean, the QR code is actually printed in the book, so when you get a copy of the book, you'll be able to do this at your leisure. But if you've got your phone camera with you now, just point it at the screen, and it'll bring up the Bandcamp page, and you can actually listen to this. And one of the sort of personal nice things about this is that at the end of the book, it gets quite sort of cosmic and transcendental, and it sort of hits on, I'll explain later when we get to that part, but it hits on all these themes of reincarnation and what life actually is. And bizarrely, this was something that my dad was very much into. He was very much into theosophy, and he would write about this and write poetry about this. And I had this random recording of my dad, who passed away last year, but I had this recording of him reading this poem that completely coincidentally seemed to mirror a lot of the themes towards the end of the book. So this album has got my dad in it, sort of reading his poem. So it's like a bizarre, everything came the wrong way around in this album, but it's a weird artifact. Anyway, go and check that out. Tell me what you think of that. Anyway, so we also step back in time. So here we have a letter written by an imaginary futurist called Giovanni Calla, who's talking about the sort of futurist project. They seek to pluck a spirit from the subluminiferous ether itself and embody it somehow in a work of art to give it form and shape. This will be our futurist man machine, our Mr. X, the spirit of the modern, the evocation of this 20th century. Marinetti, despite his disdain for anachronistic Roman numerals, punningly refers to him as Mr. XX. Thus far, he has been but a work of theatre, art, and words in freedom. Nevertheless, he assures me that through these means we have already stoked the furnaces of a generation, and as Mayakovsky tells it, this is but our opening fusillade. And so it goes on like this. This is a sort of an imaginary futurist who is attempting through art to create a kind of meme, a kind of, a sort of a powerful idea that will be embodied in art or theatre. And so again, here on the right-hand side, we have a sort of reference to a Mayakovsky poetry book from 1923 that was designed by L. Lissitzky, in which we have this double X. So again, this double X, which is the 20th century, it's the spirit of the 20th century. This is the title of the book, and also, as you'll find out soon, a character in the book. So Jack and our team at Intelligentsia think that they can talk to these ideas that Jack seem to be trying to communicate with Jack. He thinks that, well, if they're trying to talk to me through signs on buildings or in adverts or something, maybe I can make an interface that will make it much easier for them to talk to me instead of trying to use the built environment in this random way. Let me write some kind of program and give them the tools with which they can speak to me. So he does this and he hooks it up, and he gets this kind of like weird, and this is where the sort of typographic elements of the book start coming in a more bold fashion. So he thinks he's talking to someone through his screen. So it says here, on the monitors, a sudden white silence. Jack typed, "Who are you?" I am the modern. I am fueled by the fire in the hearts of all young men of revolution. So here we have our futurist man machine, the spirit of the 20th century. Sort of in this very sort of shouty, declarative, sort of, you know, like every great manifesto of that period that you've ever heard. There's, you can imagine someone punching the air and shouting and spittle coming from his mouth as he talks. These are a sort of visual equivalent of what this spirit, this XX, looks like. I am the modern. I am the 20th century. I am the double cross. I am the unknown unknown. I have been designed for a joyous purpose. I am a bullet of technology conceived in the harsh, unyielding light of reason and forged in the furnaces of the Industrial Revolution. I am XX. So this is our first sort of like zeitgeist, if you like, that seems to crop up that seems to be wanting to talk to Jack for some reason, that they've managed to talk to. And then the second run that they do, they get someone else entirely. So instead of this sort of shouty man machine, they get this sort of very sort of sedate and sophisticated sort of Victorian bill poster style. And this is, as he announces himself to be, I am the 19th Count. I am an idea made in the image of a man. And it turns out that he's the spirit of the previous century, a sort of more aristocratic and genteel and traditional age, you might say. So he talks about sort of the written word and how he can bring himself into a state of being through the written word, and the fact that this is how ideas, which have no body, which are not people, actually have some kind of permanence and being. He says here, words and images endure. When we read, these are magical incantations in which ideas are preserved. What transient thoughts of rare genius can now be saved from the shifting sands. Words and images endure. Ideas, we are physically powerless, but we are persuasive. Ideas, we get into people's minds, convince them of our righteousness, and then they do our bidding. Ideas, how do we act upon the world when we have no physical form, no hands with which to manipulate it? We let someone think us. So then we have these sort of our 19th Count and XX, the 20th century. And of course they get into an argument. So they're sort of shouting at each other here. And there's bits where the type overlaps and XX is being sort of very declarative, and the 19th Count is saying, didn't anyone tell you it's rude to shout over people? So it's also a sort of digression into the sort of other. Modernism is not just a form of art; it's a form of politics. You could argue that communism or fascism were sort of the ideas of modernism, of recreating society and culture in a more rational way, in a better way, remaking the world and the minds of all of those who live upon it. New forms, new shapes, new politics, says XX. And 19th Count isn't impressed. He says, new uniforms? It does sound like everyone will be wearing a uniform. I'm afraid I simply don't look good in a uniform. So they're sort of ideas having an argument, basically. And then XX shouts, I shout the blasphemy of fact in the faces of the gods of man. So these two are having a kind of tete-a-tete, and all of a sudden they think it's crashed. What's happening here? Everything's stopped. And then we get our third sort of memeplex, our third zeitgeist character, Girl 21, who is the spirit of our century. And she talks in tweets. So she appears and says, it's a fucking cock-waving contest in here. How many corpses pave the road to your paradise? These are our sort of, I don't know how to describe, memeplexes, zeitgeist. These are our sort of characters, if you like. I call them digital memetic entities, which is a nice acronym, DMEN, D-M-E-N. So you get, and also another motif throughout the book is this black square. So Kazimir Malevich's black square. On the right-hand side here is another one of the sort of plays that I use where I've created a door here. So our astronaut on the far side of the moon thinks that she's met some kind of alien creature, and a door in her mind is about to open, and she's about to have a conversation with this alien creature who we think might have some bearing on these messages and what's going on. So then we go into, there are 3 books, 3 parts of this novel, and the beginning of the second part opens with this short story called Ascension, and it's an 8-part short story written and laid out like an old science fiction magazine from the 50s or the 60s. So you get a map, because of course every great sci-fi novel of that period, like Dune had a map, Tolkien had a map, everyone needs a map, so I did a map. And the idea is that Jack, our character in the story, is reading this story. And this story is written by a character called Herschel Teague, who was like a sort of cross between Ron Hubbard and Philip Dick, who sort of then went on to create his own cult and went a bit bananas and ended up by sort of killing himself. But he thought he was also getting messages. And so he thought that this story that he'd written had been dictated to him by some alien being. So maybe this story somehow runs parallel to the story that is being told. So it's stories within stories, and how do these stories mirror each other and influence each other? So anyway, this is all laid out a bit like one of these old magazines would be, in 2 columns with illustrations and whatnot. And I went to, this is the back cover of the novel. It shows you these books. So the idea is that this is all the reprints of the Ascension story. So it appears in a pulp magazine, and then gets printed in a hardback, and then appears in a cheap paperback. And as the years go by, it kind of gets reassessed in the way that, say, Philip Dick's writing was reassessed. And so it becomes reissued as a sort of modern classic, and then you get the annotated version, and then you get the illustrated version with sort of deep, meaningful notes added. So I mocked up all of these covers for the kind of history of this fictitious novel. So it starts off with these in the sort of, I would say, sort of mid-50s maybe. And then you sort of move up through the 60s. There's sort of English editions, American paperback editions, sort of reissues. So you're sort of now moving into the late 60s and early 70s. You've got a Chris Foss cover there at the end. And then sort of into the late 70s, and then there's a foreign French edition in the middle, sort of an 80s reissue. And then it starts, move a bit more upmarket in the same way that sort of Lovecraft's material, which was all published in the pulps originally, is now part of the Penguin Classics series, right up to the one on the right, which is a sort of, much more sort of high-end reissue of it. So there's this sort of fake history of this fake story. Anyway, so you read this story bit by bit. So it's in eight parts. And in the novel, it's inserted in the bit between when we lose contact with Dana, who's the astronaut on the far side of the moon, investigating what we think is this crashed alien ship. And we lose contact with her. And then we have this story. And then at the end of the story, we regain contact with her. So the idea being that maybe this story is somehow metaphorically the conversation that she is having on the far side of the moon with this alien creature. Because again, it's all about language and the communication, and how, if you don't understand language, how is meaning, how are ideas transmitted? How would you talk to an alien? So while that's going on, also, we get sort of flashbacks. We got flashbacks into the creation, the origin, if you like, of XX and the kind of sort of art of the futurists. And here we have the origin of the 19th Count. So we have a letter by Horace Walpole, written from Strawberry Hill House, in which he, and so it's sort of alluded to the fact that the 19th Count is basically the Comte de Saint-Germain, who was a sort of celebrated sort of mystic and sort of man of mystery, basically. We find out through this that basically he was a creation of Horace Walpole and his friends from the theatre. And he says, and again, what they're trying to do is they're trying to create an idea or a personification of an idea that will outlive flesh and blood people, but will somehow be influential into the future. So Horace Walpole here says, "Our immortal man of tomorrow will be of the coming age, not of this. He will be our defense against continental excess, the alien and the other. The Count of the 19th century, fashioned not from flesh but from words, will serve as a repository of the finest ideals of man. He represents all that is noble in the purebred gentleman of letters and learning, and with the wisdom to use such knowledge for the benefit of all without quick recourse to violence or vulgarity." So anyway, that's the sort of, through documents and flashbacks and flash forwards, we get to sort of fill in the origins of our characters. So anyway, Jack is now sort of out and about with his laptop, trying to meet XX, the 19th Count, and Girl 21, the D-Men. And they've gone off to, what they've discovered is that when they're in this sort of virtual world, and by putting on virtual reality glasses, they can actually see these characters. So it's as if they exist in our three-dimensional space as a sort of, what's the word? Augmented reality. So it's not like you're stepping into an alien world. By putting on VR glasses, you can see XX, you can see the 19th Count, you can see Girl 21. So XX, when they first get to see him, looks like a cross between what's his name? The guy who did the rock drill, I've forgotten the sculptor's name off the top of my head. Anyway, and a cross between the rock drill sculpture and, say, a Wyndham Lewis self-portrait, a sort of vorticist cubist self-portrait. The 19th Count is immaculately white, sort of top hat, cravat. I pictured him as the kind of character in, oh God, I'm blanking all of these names here. I apologise. This is, I think I'm actually, I have some kind of mental disease where I just cannot remember names. Anyway, there's a sort of romanticist painting, the name of which I am blanking on, the artist of which I am blanking on, where you've got a dandy looking out over a sea of mist. And the 19th count is sort of very much sort of based on that kind of romantic figure. Girl 21 is when Jack, our hero, first meets her, he can't sort of work it out. She seems to have a sort of face that seems to stutter and move. And it becomes apparent to him that she's basically built her face from a flick book of selfies that she's found on the internet. So they're all lit from different angles, they're all different people, but the eyes and the mouth stay in the same place. So she has basically managed to sort of animate every expression that she needs by stealing other people's faces. So she's sort of the kind of essence of the, you know, the Instagram online generation. Anyway, they're Jack at this point is sort of following our characters, and in order to find out where they've gone, he's sort of picking up whatever happens to be at hand and allowing them to talk through him. So at this point, he's picked up a copy of the Daily Mail. So they're speaking to him through the Daily Mail. And then he gets in, so they tell him to get a taxi to the Tate Gallery. And then when he's in the taxi, of course, he's looking at the meter in the taxi, and the 19th count is talking to him through the meter in the taxi. And as he's talking with the 19th count, the taxi driver thinks that he's actually talking to him. So there's this conversation going on. Then at the Tate Gallery, he's walking around a Liechtenstein exhibit. So he's kind of having a conversation with the D-men, who at this point aren't responding to him, at the same time as reading the captions on the Liechtenstein paintings. So what I did here was I took all of the dialogue from the Liechtenstein paintings, which was all lifted from old DC comics, mostly DC comics anyway. So it's not even Liechtenstein's dialogue. He changed a word now and again, but now here and there, but he stole it all. He stole everything that he did, quite frankly, and badly at that. So I'm reappropriating Liechtenstein here. And then finally, our sort of D-men sort of catch up with him and sort of tell them where he is. And so he's looking out through a door frame, and he can see the Tate Modern, the words of the Tate Modern written on the window, back to front, which is what you see on the right-hand page here. And it's been cropped in the doorway, and it says dome. And in the middle of the O is, it says here, Jack felt a numinous jolt of significance as semantic signifiers fell into place like deadbolts on a heavy door snugly ramming home. Dome. Positioned perfectly centrally in the O, he could see the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral. There it was, clearly circled in black, his final destination. The D-men would be waiting for him there. Celebratory fireworks went off in his mind. And then again, we get the wham, pop. All of these are bits of lettering that Liechtenstein appropriated that I've reappropriated here. Here's another example of where I've sort of used, this time I'm using every fifth line and then running 5 conversations simultaneously to sort of give you the idea of what it sounds like to be on a tube train. So you've got the sound of the tube train, you've got the dot matrix indicators, you've got all the other stuff. And so it says here, now they sat, and at this point, Jack has basically fessed up to the other people who he's working with at Intelligentsia that he's seeing these things, that he's talking to them, that he's talking to the people at Jodrell Bank about the signal from space, that there's an astronaut called Dana who they think they've now lost, who has been talking to this alien on the moon. He's basically broken every non-disclosure agreement he's been asked to sign and just told all his friends about this. And they don't really, and he says, in the crypt of St. Paul's, he had, in flagrant disregard for the non-disclosure order he had signed, told Harriet and Nixon all about his visit to Jodrell, about Dana Normanson and the man on the moon. It was a testament to the events of the previous few days and the times they all felt they were now living in, that they took the revelation that there was an alien in a crashed spaceship on the far side of Earth's satellite on board without much pushback, and had then decided to go to Nando's. They had questions Jack had done his best to answer, though he could sense that they passed what he told them through their internalized Jack filter, which he imagined was like a bullshit detector, but set to a much higher sensitivity. In this, he knew he only had himself to blame. Now they sat there without talking, together but apart, island minds ruminating in the memetic fug of the train carriage. The incidental background music of wheels on track, fragmentary conversation, breakbeats escaping from cheap earbuds, advertising messages and dot matrix destination indicators had become drained of all meaning, reduced to a series of repetitive signal oscillations that moved an eardrum or fell across a retina without interpretation. So as we get to the end of the Planetfall story, which is the old pulp story, which I won't go into, but seems to sort of mimic what's happening in our world, we then sort of come back to Dana, and Dana has been found and brought back on a shuttle and is now in sort of debriefing in some sort of secret location. So we then get these transcripts of the conversations that she's having with her handlers, where they're trying to work out what's happened to her. And again, it's about this kind of the way that language works and the way that alphabets and meaning is transmitted, and she's finding it very hard to put into words what's happened to her, because she had some sort of direct experience in which the alien telepathically or somehow communicated with her, and she has to somehow bring this into everyday language. So we get her transcripts, and then we get the kind of fallout of the very, very quickly, other people realize that if you put on these virtual reality glasses and you have a certain bit of software, that you can also look into the virtual realm and see things. And along with our D-men, our digital memetic entities, we begin to see the fact that the signal from space is not a message, it's not a code, it's not written in language. It's not from aliens, it is the aliens. It's like the informational substrate, it's like the DNA, the informational substrate that is the aliens. And so people start to be able to see them with their sort of VR glasses on. And of course, this spreads far and wide very, very quickly. And so there's a couple of chapters where I talk about the fallout of this. And so there are news reports, it gets spoken about on Woman's Hour, it's sort of debated at the Oxford Union, sort of various podcasts talk about it. And so it was a really sort of great opportunity to sort of spoof, on the one hand, the kind of conspirasphere where they think it's all fake, they think it's all part of some sort of weird threat to liberty to sort of shut us all down, and on the other hand, people think it's part of some sort of globalized sort of tech takeover. So the ideas sort of spread out into the real world. So they're still trying to talk to these aliens. They're still trying to figure out the language. And so they begin to get, or Jack begins to get, notation. So I was trying to sort of picture what alien alphabets might look like. So on the left here, I sort of imagined a character with very long hair. And then in order to communicate, they tie knots in their beards. So their written language would look like, their orthography would sort of develop from this. So you get vertical staves almost with dots on that represent the length and the position of these sort of knots on a beard. On the right-hand side, I was sort of picturing what something like a dolphin, if dolphin developed language and needed to write it down, what might dolphin speak look like? So this is something that's based on bubbles coming out of a blowhole on top of a dolphin. On the left here, we have something that might be like a diffraction grating with light being passed through, so you get this kind of moire effect. And on the right-hand side, I was imagining something that had a carapace, like a beetle, that could sort of flash up different spots or colours on its back. And again, how the alphabet that a creature like that might have would look. So we have all of our different sort of characters in play here, and I'll skip over some of the story because I don't want to sort of spoil it for those of you who are going to read it. But one of the other themes is the sort of power that ideas have, both for good and both for evil. And the 19th Count here, who's been designed basically with this in mind, has a bit of a speech here where he says, "Herewith the truth. In the real world, there are very few cackling vaudeville villains lit theatrically from below, rubbing their sweaty palms with undisguised glee as they watch the world burn. Very few bastards in this world or any other have done bad things simply for the sake of doing bad things. Evil is rarely that banal. No, the most dangerous ideas are those that promise to deliver a better world, a fairer world. Who doesn't devoutly wish for such a resolution, to cleanse and sanitize our future from the different, the deviant, the mistaken, and the misled? A perfect world in which all are in righteous agreement and dissenters confess the error of their heterodoxy. The most dangerous ideas will allow you to commit the most barbarous acts imaginable and simultaneously convince you you're a saint. Save me from your best intentions." So he's very much sort of articulating maybe the kind of the sort of Horace Walpole aristocratic 19th century worries that the French Revolution might happen in England, and how might we protect ourselves against such barbarous modernism. And on the right-hand side here, you get one of the rare moments of agreement between the 19th Count and XX, where the 19th Count says, "How do you kill a bad idea?" And XX says, "You have a better one." So then, again, without sort of spoiling too much of the story, we have a sort of almost like a battle of different styles where various sort of elements are sort of throwing different memetic ideas at each other. So at this point on the right, they're sort of getting bogged down in sort of as Harriet, one of our main characters, says here. She says, "Fuck me, it's an unholy marriage of Jugendstil arts and crafts and Biber Nouveau. We're drowning in a faux medieval fantasy." And then Jack says, "Jack had a finger paused over the return key." Oh, sorry. Yes. "Don't you know your pop history? Weren't you at St. Martin's School of Art in 75? There was a second of background cassette hiss overlaid with the frying bacon crackle of a needle in a dirty groove, then a thunder of rolling drums." So we then sort of like move into something that looks like a punk flyer. So I'm sort of, again, I'm playing not ideology against ideology, but sort of meme against meme, idea against idea, cultural motif against cultural motif. And then I get to work in Wim Crowell's new alphabet, of course, why would I not, which we sort of zoom in on and have, again, the black square and what the black square represents. I sort of spend a bit of time talking about black squares, which again is the album cover for the soundtrack to this. It's the Intelligentsia logo. It's many, many things that I talk about in the book. And then at this point in the book, when you're probably about 2/3 of the way through, I have the contents and all the font design credits, because we get to a point where one of our characters is sort of becomes aware, because in this sort of stripped down modernist section of the book, Jack is sort of removing the formatting in the text. So he takes away speech marks, first of all, and people don't know who's talking and what the explanatory dialogue is. So it's almost like the characters in the book can hear me, the omniscient narrator, describing what they are doing, and they find this quite weird and off-putting. And then he takes away capital letters, which are used for naming. So our characters no longer have capital letters at the beginnings of their names. So they begin to lose a sense of selfhood. So it's the way that in which, because my characters that I've written into this story are fictitious, just as they're memetic constructs, just as in the story the D-men are memetic constructs according to my fictional characters. So this is the kind of the meta. It's all getting a bit meta. Anyway, so at this point, our main character, Jack, sort of understands in some way that perhaps he is part of some narrative. Maybe there's some kind of story that he's part of. And he seems to be able to sort of rise above reality into a dimension in which he can see a kind of narrative structure stretching out on all sides for him, which is the book that he's in. And so at this point, he can see the contents page, basically, of the book that he's in. It's a bit like, I don't know, in the real world, being able to sort of look down on it and see the whole pattern of reality. I actually used this idea before in the previous book I did called Culture, Ideas Can Be Dangerous, where I dealt with sort of ideas and the way that ideas are transmitted. And I had a chapter of the book called Maps, and there was a spread in the chapter called Maps called This is the Map of the Book. And that's where I put the contents. And I remember one review that complained, oh, he's made a mistake. You know, I was halfway through before I got to the contents, sort of completely not understanding that that was entirely and completely the purpose of the exercise. So having been met with incomprehension in a review the first time around, of course, I thought I'd do exactly the same thing and use the same idea again here. So this is sort of, you know, probably 2/3 of the way through before you actually get the whole contents. And you get all the font design credits as well. So every single font is listed. So this is another scene where our astronaut, Dana, finds that she can step in and out of the realm in which the D-men exist. So she can kind of vanish from our three-dimensional space and into this kind of idea space, and then sort of somehow step back out again. So at this point here, she's stepped out of idea space, and she hasn't got any idea where she is. It's dark. She assumes for a second that maybe she's blind. So she's talking to herself here. She's sort of, you know, take deep breaths, count to 10. So if I read it here, it says 5, 6, huff, 7, and then there's an echo on the other side of the page. So she realizes she's in an enclosed space. Huff 8, huff 9, I see. And then on the following spread, having counted up to 9, we get an X, which is also obviously a 10. And then we get an X1, which is 11. So it continues her counting. But then it transpires that this is the exit from, and she's actually somehow ended up in an underground tunnel. So she's coming up out of the underground tunnel into the light. And as she sort of comes up into the light, you get the kind of cacophony and noise of London that sort of bears down upon her. So moving right to the end now, I sort of play with the idea of what the signal from space actually is, and I won't tell you what it is, no spoilers, and how we as a species deal with that, and how we as a species communicate with all the creatures that are already in the signal. And then the sort of final part of the book is what happens to the signal next as it sort of is retransmitted from the Earth and sort of spreads out into the universe. So here I sort of, like, you know, attempt to somehow sort of again, create a kind of orthography that has new signs and symbols for speech and thought and various other things that maybe the standard alphabet, the standard Latin alphabet, doesn't allow ourselves to do. And then at the sort of final part of the book, I sort of mirror the signal. So we began with the digital noughts and ones that led us up into the book, and then we sort of end with the signal disappearing as it sort of travels sort of out into the universe again. And that is the end. And at this point, I hope that some of you would be clapping. Absolutely. I can see some of you clapping. I can't hear anything.
Can you all hear me again now?
I can hear you, yes.
Brilliant. Yeah, there's loads of fantastic comments, Ryan, which I will make sure I screenshot for you, and so you can read everyone's adulation and comments and things. Thank you so much for such a fantastic insight into your book. It's just made me really appreciate it even more as I'm reading it, and I know I've got a long way to go, but it's just been absolutely brilliant. So we've actually got quite a lot of questions, so I will go through them if I can just find the first one. So if anyone has any more questions as we're going through, please do add them to the end of the chat, and we'll try to get to them, as many of them as possible. Zach Mason has said he loves the use of the dominoes for the chapter numbers, and I was just wondering, were they intentional? Are they linked to the story in any way?
They don't play a major role, other than that they're another way to encode meaning. And there is a scene where, as I said, sort of Jack becomes aware of a sort of greater narrative structure that he happens to be part of, and is he an idea in the same way that the D-men are ideas that have sort of somehow coalesced? Maybe he is too. Is that he sees this kind of game of dominoes being played. So I kind of riff on that a bit, yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Stephen Elston has said, there are echoes of House of Leaves and Moby Dick in the style and content of XX. Were there any particular books that made you realise this concept could work as a novel graphic?
The comparison to Moby Dick has been made by a couple of reviewers, actually. It's been called the Moby Dick of science fiction. So yes, is the answer to that. I think as a graphic designer, you're kind of aware of not only what the words say, but how they look. You know, that's the kind of world we live in. And as a graphic designer, quite often we rarely write our own copy. We should write our own copy. This is me writing my own copy, and I think everyone should have a crack at writing their own copy. You know, why should we just make bespoke suits for other people's copy when we should be? It's like it's going to sound a bit pejorative, but I think that having worked as a graphic designer for some time, there is so much shit that we do just dressing up shit, and it would be nice if we spent our skills more productively in a lot of ways. Anyway, you know, if we could peel ourselves off the face of commerce in a way that comic book artists and writers have and musicians have, I think graphic designers should make that leap and create design for design's sake. Sounds a bit up its own arse, but you know, the design that is the thing in and of itself, and I think we need more of that. House of Leaves, I did really enjoy House of Leaves. That was that an influence? Probably. It wasn't a major influence, but there have been several books that do deal with the look of things on the page. I mean, there was J.J. Abrams' S, which came out a couple of years ago, which did a similar thing. The Rorschach texts, going right back to Tristram Shandy, things like that. So it's not, I'm not claiming that there are no books that have not been set in Times New Roman justified page on page before. But I think it's rare to have a book that has been conceived. I mean, I literally wrote this straight into InDesign. So I was writing in the font that it was supposed to be in. Whereas all the books that I know that have typographic shenanigans going on were probably written by one person and then designed by a graphic designer. They weren't done as the one thing together at once. I mean, I could be wrong. I could be wrong in that
Sure.
other people have written and designed their own books, but I've not seen it.
There's a question about how did you collaborate with the composers of the book's soundtrack? Were you involved heavily with really strong ideas in mind, or did you let them have free reign with the book as inspiration?
I gave them the review. So I wrote the review of the album, and I said, make the album that would be reviewed like this. Right. And that was pretty much my sort of advice was, I mean, some of the tracks are very ambient and atmospheric, and other tracks are more sort of driving and upbeat. But there's a great variety of sounds there. So my job was to sort of somehow articulate some of the themes of the book in how I thought that might sound. So my instructions were fairly abstract in that degree, but they ran with it and came up with an amazing piece of work that is absolutely perfect, I think.
And following on from that, Elizabeth Fraser has says, I love the idea of the writer of a novel connecting and collaborating with a musician composer during the writing of a novel. Is that something you would like to do more of, think it could be explored more?
So say it again. So writing the novel while sort of in tandem with the composing, you mean?
Do you think it's something you'd like to do more of or could be explored more?
Yes. I think that would be a collaborative thing, though, and I think that the thing with XX is it's all me, and you know I drew every drawing, I took the photographs, I designed all the weird fonts that didn't already exist. I mean, when I was sort of going back and using historic forms, I would use the relevant fonts, but if I wanted something a bit weird and new and something that was going to happen in the future, I would design those fonts. So if I was working with a musician on a sort of future book, it would be a collaboration. But I have actually written another one, another novel, which probably won't see the light of day for another year or so yet, which I will probably talk about another time. But yeah.
Cool. There's a question from Zach Mason. How did you decide the different styles of typography to fit the memetic forms of certain characters? Also, what advice would you give to a young designer?
The characters, well, it was very much their tone of voice. And I think that everyone who has ever chosen a font from a font menu knows how the typeface choice changes the tone of voice. And I think tone of voice is the phrase that I would sort of always come back to. Yeah. So if and it seems like such an obvious thing, I just do not know why every novel doesn't have a font for every different character, depending on what that character is. You know, if they're Gilt Sans, if they're Times New Roman, if they're Helvetica, it'll tell you something about what this character is about, or some other font that is created specifically for the job at hand. And this has been done in comic books. I mean, comic book fonts tend to all look a bit Comic Sans-y, but within that sort of remit, you do get quite a broad range of styles of lettering, and you always have done. And I think that the more expressive way that cartoon font balloons, comic strip font balloons are done is something that could easily be imported into the regular novel. I just don't see why it doesn't happen all the time. I'd like for it to just be how books are, you know, not something that you have to sort of roll out on a special occasion. I would just like all books to think about the font that they're set in to some degree. What was the other part? Advice to...
What advice would you give a young designer?
Be original, work hard, don't forget to invoice.
Very, very good advice. Next question is from Lisa Kirkham. Given the themes embodiment, word made flesh, containment, endurance, and so on, do you think that this would work as a digital novel graphic?
A digital novel? It is available, or it will be available as a sort of PDF that you can read. I think it loses something because I talk about the book being a vessel. So, and the way that Jack lifts up the book in the book and describes the book that you're reading. So it does sort of lose a bit. But yeah, you can read it on screen. I mean, I would very much not want to sort of animate the words or add sound into the book itself, because as there was a fad some years ago where comics were like this, where you'd get a comic but it would have panels in which basic animation happened or there were sound effects, and as and people were describing this as Comics Plus, and some wag said it's not Comics Plus, it's animation minus, and it kind of did look like that. It looked a bit shitty. So I think that if you're going to do that, you are basically probably making a movie or some other thing. So I think while you are sort of pushing at certain parameters of what a novel can be, I think you should be cognizant that if you push them too far, it ceases to be a novel at all and becomes some other thing. And it might actually just be a bad version of some other thing.
Great. I'm just looking for the next question. From Elizabeth Fraser again. I love the visual variety so far, and a question I have. Did you find the visual look was always led by the context of the story, or was the story sometimes influenced by a visual idea you had?
I think it was a bit of both, if I'm honest. I think that basically there are so many bits of experimental graphic design that I've seen over the years where the content is just an excuse to sort of play around on the page. And the graphic designer is not, either they've just chosen a piece of text that they came across, or the text is just so they've got something to manipulate. It's not the thing that they created themselves. And so it needed to not be this bolt-on to a rather ordinary story. It needed to be front and center and be an essential part of what the story was about. And once I'd cracked that, once I'd realized how it was that I was going to talk about ideas and the way that language works on the page in a novelistic fashion, the form of that became much more obvious. But yeah, bits of it were, how do I describe this scene that I've written, or as I'm writing it, you know, how does this look on the page? And other bits where I had a really interesting idea for what a page might look like, and then I would see if I could shoehorn that in. I mean, I did take out, you're describing it as a monster book, I took out 350 pages. Wow. So there's a lot of stuff that it wasn't necessarily uninteresting. It was just not. It was part of another story, or it wasn't relevant enough to the thrust of the narrative that I couldn't leave it out. And I was determined that it wouldn't go over 1,000 pages, because you don't want to test your readers' patience or their wallets too much. So under 1,000 pages was my cutoff.
So you were kind of your own editor as well. Did anyone else sort of edit the book at all, and once it was taken up by a publisher? Or
I went through, I mean, because this is the first novel I've ever written, and I probably would be a lot more efficient about writing it now, but I went through about 14 or 15 versions, and each version I printed out on print on demand as a physical object, and then sat down and read it from beginning to end. So I tried to imagine what the kind of punter would feel coming to this. And I try to make it propulsive as a story, so that even if you are not interested in graphic design or typography or anything like that, these things don't divert you from enjoying a comprehensible story that also is a sort of philosophical discussion about the way ideas work on the page. And the reviews, much to my astonishment and pleasure, have completely got this. They've been absolutely amazing. There's not been a bad review, and people who I thought would just be flummoxed by all this typographic fireworks have completely kind of got it. So we had a really great review in the Financial Times, in the Big Issue, which is, I very much doubt in the Venn diagram of readership that there's a crossover there. But and then the Daily Mail, which is, I don't think there's any crossover between those three whatsoever. SFX magazine. So it's all been quite heartening that I haven't. There were periods where I thought I'd just produced this enormous, self-indulgent, pompous, impenetrable exercise in obscurantism, and I'm heartened to find out that there are people who have genuinely felt for the characters and their predicament and have really kind of connected with it. So hopefully that will continue.
That's great. Sorry, we've got loads of questions. I will try and get through as many as we can in the next 10 minutes. John Goodman has asked, we're wondering how the UK version will differ from the US version, accepting the spellings, covers, obviously.
It's exactly the same.
Okay, great.
Yeah, what was interesting is that quite often you correct for UK or US English, but because a lot of the book was transcripts or the characters themselves were English, or, I mean, Dana Normanson, Jack, they're all different nationalities. So we just had whatever was the relevant style of English for each of those characters. So we didn't need to change it. So the American version has a different cover, which I very much like. It's very, it's nice to have two sort of covers for the same book, in fact. And different end papers, but other than that, it's the same story.
A lot of the questions are quite similar, so I'm just trying to. Sorry if I've missed yours, because I think some you've covered them already. Get from Ivan. There's a question of how on earth do you plot a book like this?
There's plotting. I think there's as many different ways to plot as there are writers. I think that the analogy that I use is the way that I was taught how to do figure drawing. And when you're drawing the figure, you start. You don't sort of start in the top left-hand corner and draw an eye with all the eyelashes, and then a couple of hours later you're sort of putting the finishing touches on a toenail, and then you sort of step back and the figure is there in all of its perfection. What you do is you sort of create a framework. So you put in a kind of line where the spine goes, and then the shoulders, and then the legs, just literally a line maybe, and then a circle for the head. And then you step back and you think, is that pose right? Is the stance right? Is the body language right? And then you sort of adjust it, and then you sort of when you're happy with that, then you sort of flesh it out with some musculature or whatever. So it's this kind of slow building where you try and keep the totality of it as fluid as possible, as long as possible. And so what I did was, because I wrote it directly in InDesign, I had all the pages, but then on a separate layer in really big letters, so I could see it in the kind of pages view in InDesign. In really big magenta letters, I had like a 3 or 4 word description of what that chapter was. So, and the chapters are very short. So I was quite a long way into it before I had even names for the characters. It was kind of bizarre. They were kind of placeholders because I needed certain characters with certain attributes that needed to function in certain ways in the story. And I know that I've heard writers that basically start from the character and just sort of write, and at the end of each day, they don't know what the character's going to do the next day. And so they just sit down the next day and the characters write again. I mean, this was absolutely the opposite of that, is that they needed to be functional levers in the story that I could pull. But what I was doing is, when I had it in that format, I was shunting bits around right up until the last draft. I mean, the whole Ascension story got moved forward and back and forward and back. And then the sort of form comes out of that. But it sounds like the characters didn't flesh out, but they did. And what was really nice, one of the nicest parts of it, is by the time I got to the end, I really knew who these characters were. And so I could go back and sort of, with a full knowledge of who and how they sounded, and what their preferences were. I could go back and put all of this information into their mouths. So over the sort of, it went through 14 drafts, but those later drafts were very much sort of bringing the character of these characters to the fore. I have no idea whether other writers write that way, but that's what worked for me.
No, that's great. Another one from John Goodman. The themes and plot seem so natural as you tell it, but was there a point at where it became daunting, overwhelming, never-ending for you?
Well, it took me about 4.5 years, and this was just sort of like Sunday afternoons, when I wasn't in the studio doing, designing Batman logos for DC and all the regular stuff that I do. So it was sort of it was a back project, if you like, for the bulk of that 4.5 years. And then as I got towards the end of it, and I thought that it might actually be a thing, I took about 3 months off to, I kept my regular clients going, but I sort of put as much away of 3 months to finish it. And then that was probably about the 4th or 5th draft before it actually went out to some friends of mine who read those early drafts. And then on the feedback I got from that, I sort of made quite a few other adjustments. How many hours it took me altogether, I have absolutely no idea.
And I think that's about it. I think most of the other questions you've already covered. So I think it's a good time to wrap up and go to the virtual St. Bride pub at the end of the evening with our beers individually. And I would just like to thank everyone. I'd like to thank you on behalf of everyone at St. Bride and everyone who's attended, who've clearly really enjoyed your fantastic lecture. And we really appreciate all the hard work you've put into making tonight happen, especially given the online circumstances. I can see lots of people clapping in the corner of my screen, and we're getting lots of lovely comments, so I'll make sure we send you those. But thank you so much